Hi everyone, and welcome to Module 10. This week we are stepping into what is often called the beginning of the modern world. And I don't mean modern the way that we kind of casually use it today. I mean a moment in history where everything starts to shift. How people live, how they work, how they see themselves, and even how they start to understand reality. And I want you to keep one idea in mind as we move through this lecture. This is not about the past. This is about understanding the world you are living in right now. So before we do anything else, I want you to actually just take a moment to look at this slide. Not glance at it, but I want you to really look, because everything we are doing this week is right here in front of you. So let's start on the left side. What do you notice here? You see a crowded city street, people that are packed together, vendors, movement, noise. This is what life starts to look like during the industrial era. People are moving into cities in huge numbers. Immigrants, workers, families, they are all looking for opportunity. But it's not calm, it's not slow, it's not personal, it's busy, it's dense, it's very overwhelming. And this is modern life in its beginning phases. Now, shift your eyes to the center image. This is a painting by Monet called A Bar at the Folie Bergère. And I love this painting for this unit because at first glance it looks just like a simple scene, a woman who's kind of just standing behind a bar. But when you actually look at this painting closer, you'll see that she is surrounded by people. You'll see it in the reflection of the mirror that's behind her. It's very clever. And yet she is still seemingly looking like she feels like she's completely alone. And there's this sense of real disconnection here. And that is something that is really important about modern life. Because even though people are more connected physically, they're living in cities, they're surrounded by crowds, there's also a growing sense of isolation. Now, move to the very right, and here you can see factories, smoke, industry. This is power. This is quote unquote progress. This is the engine of everything that we are about to talk about. But look at it again, because you can obviously see that it's also pollution. It's labor. It's inequality. There is a cost to progress. So just in this one slide, you are seeing three versions of modern life that are all emerging at the same time. You have the crowded city, you have the modern individual, and you have the industrial machine. And this is the tension of the entire unit, because modern life is not just about progress, it's also about contradiction. And that is where we are going this week. We are going to take a look at how people tried to make sense of a world that suddenly felt faster, bigger, and a little bit more uncertain, and how artists, photographers, and thinkers weren't just documenting that change, they responded to it. All right, so let's come back to this question. What happens when the world changes? And before you try to answer that, I want you to actually sit with what you are seeing here for just a moment, because this slide is showing you two sides of that change that was happening at the same time. So let's start on the left. We have this train station. There's light, movement, people constantly coming and going. There's energy here, there's motion, there's this sense that everything is moving forward. And that, of course, is not accidental. Railroads were one of the most important technologies of the industrial era. They didn't just move goods, they completely changed how people experienced distance and time and connection. Places that once felt very far away suddenly became quite reachable, and travel that used to take days or weeks could now happen much faster. So because of that, the world itself starts to feel smaller. It starts to feel more connected and more immediate. Now, shift your attention to the right. Here you see a crowded urban street, something like New York during the Gilded Age. Anyone watch that HBO series, by the way? Because if you haven't, watch it. I personally love it. I love this time period, and you'll see why. There is so much going on. But a little side note, I'm also working on research for a book that I'm co-writing with my dad about this time period. So that's another reason why I'm really excited about this module and getting to share all of this information with you. So, Gilded Age, watch it. It's super good, and it will really kind of give you a great idea of what was going on through this time period if you want to kind of immerse yourself in a TV show about that. So, just by looking at these two images, you can kind of feel and see how very different this space is. It's dense, it's busy, it's layered with activity. You have people and carts and buildings packed very tightly together. Everything is happening at once. And this is the direct result of industrialization. People are leaving the rural areas, they're leaving their farms, they're immigrating from other countries, and they're moving into cities in huge numbers. They're looking for work in factories, in construction, and in these new industries that are popping up. And what that creates is something entirely new. You have modern urban life. So here's where it gets really interesting, because these spaces are full of people, and yet they're not necessarily full of connection. You know how you can be surrounded by hundreds of others and still kind of feel anonymous? This is one of the defining experiences of modernity, that tension between being constantly around others and yet still feeling very disconnected. Sound familiar? So when we come back to the ideas on this slide here, they start to feel a little more real. We're not just talking about rapid technological change in an abstract way. We're actually talking about railroads and electricity and mass production systems that are transforming daily life almost overnight in a very tangible way. We're not just talking about new cities and identities. We're literally talking about people who are leaving behind familiar communities, their families, their countries, and they are becoming part of this much larger, more anonymous system. And they're having to figure out who they are within all of that. And then we get to the most important idea. You have new ways of seeing reality, because when your environment changes this dramatically, you don't just live differently. You start to perceive and see things differently. You notice movement, you notice light, you notice moments instead of permanence. And that shift in perception is exactly what drives everything we are about to explore. It's what leads to the rise of photography. It's what leads artists like Monet and Degas to focus on fleeting moments and changing light in their artwork. And it's what eventually pushes art into abstraction, where it's no longer about what something looks like, but how it's experienced. So, this question: what happens when the world changes? It's not just something that they were asking about, that they were asking in the 19th century and that we're asking about the 19th century. It is most definitely still something that you are still navigating right now. And that is what makes this unit so powerful. All right, so now let's move into what is actually driving all of this change. And this is the second industrial revolution. But before I define anything, I want you just to take a moment and really look at what's in front of you on the slide, because these are two images that are doing a lot of work for us. So let's start on the left. I love this painting. This is called The Shoe Shop by Elizabeth Sparhawk Jones, and this was painted around the year 1911. And I love this piece because nothing about it feels really dramatic at first, right? It's quiet, it's subtle. It almost feels like just a moment you walked into or kind of caught in passing. What we see are women working inside a shop, not a factory, not heavy machinery, nothing that immediately screams industrial revolution, and yet this is exactly what modern work is starting to look like. This is wage labor. This is consumer culture. This is part of a system. And if you look very closely, the scene feels a little blurred, right? Like it's a little in motion. It's not crisp or fixed, and that's not accidental. That is reflecting something bigger. And it's this sense that life is speeding up, that moments are passing quickly, that everything feels just slightly unsettled. These women are not just working, they are part of a new rhythm of time, productivity, and expectation that didn't exist in the same way before. Now, move your attention over to the right. This image is definitely not subtle at all. This is the pyramid of the capitalist system, and it lays everything out for you very clearly. You can literally see the structure, layer by layer. At the top, wealth, power, control. Nothing new there, right? And as your eye moves down, you see the people holding up the system. Workers, laborers, everyday individuals whose effort makes everything above them possible. Nothing new there either, right? And at the very bottom, those doing the hardest work, often with the least reward. And this is where these two images start to connect, because the women in the shoe shop, they exist inside this system. They may not be in a factory, they may not be at the very bottom of that pyramid, but they are still part of this larger economic structure that is emerging through industrialization and capitalism. So when we talk about the second industrial revolution, we're not just talking about inventions or machines. We are talking about a complete restructuring of society. Industrial systems are expanding across the United States, Europe, and Japan. You have factories, businesses, and global trade networks that are growing rapidly. They're connecting places and people in ways that never existed before. And at the same time, new sources of power like steel, electricity, oil are transforming how everything functions. These are not just technologies. They are forces that shape where people live, how they work, and how cities develop. And then, of course, there's mass production. This is the turning point because people are no longer primarily creating things on their own anymore. They're working within systems. They're busy in factories and shops and businesses all day where their labor becomes part of something larger. So when you step back and you look at these two images together, they tell a really powerful story. On one side, you have the lived experience of modern work, quiet, everyday, almost ordinary. On the other, you have the structure behind it all, a system that's built on hierarchy, labor, and power. And what is so important about this moment in history is that people are starting to become aware of both of these at the same time. And that tension between everyday life and the systems that are shaping it, between what feels normal and what's actually happening underneath, this is at the heart of modernity. All right, so now let's shift this perspective just a little because up to this point, we have been talking about change in terms of experience, how it feels to live in a rapidly transforming world. But now I want you to think about how this change was actually being presented to people at the time. And one of the best examples of that is the St. Louis World's Fair in 1904. And if you can see what's on this slide, even just briefly, you can start to get a sense of the scale of this fair. On one side, you have this massive Ferris wheel. People are gathered around it, they're looking up, and on the other side, you have this wide, almost sort of idealized view of the fairgrounds. Clean, organized, expansive. And that's the whole point. This was a showcase of progress. The World's Fair was specifically designed to display innovation, to show people what the modern world could be. Visitors would walk through exhibits featuring electric streetcars, early automobiles, new communication technologies, even x-rays. Things that for the majority of people, they would never have even felt almost unbelievable. So from this perspective, progress looks super exciting, right? It looks impressive, controlled. It feels like the future is full of possibility. But what is important and what I want you to start thinking about is that this is a very curated version of reality. This is progress as a performance. It's something designed to be seen, admired, and celebrated. Because while all of this innovation is happening, there are also overcrowded cities, difficult working conditions and growing inequalities that are happening at the same time. And those realities are not what you see highlighted here. So this is the moment that becomes really important, because now we have two ways of understanding modern life. There's the version that's being presented, clean, exciting, full of possibility. And then there's the version that people are actually living, complex, uneven, and sometimes difficult. And that gap between how progress is presented and how it is experienced is something that artists, writers, and thinkers are going to start responding to in really powerful ways. So, as we move forward, I want you to keep that contrast in mind, because it is going to show up again and again in everything that we are going to look at this week. All right, so now we need to sit with this other side of the story, because up to this point we have been looking and talking primarily about the progress, the innovation, movement, possibility. But as I mentioned earlier, progress always has a cost. And if you take just a moment and look at what's in front of you here, you can start to really see that shift. On the left, we see children. They are standing together, holding tools, dressed in worn clothing. This is what child labor looks like. And it's something that becomes very common during the industrial era. Children were working in factories and mines and mills, often long hours, in very dangerous conditions and for very little pay, if pay at all. And what is striking about images like this is how very normal it was at the time. This was not hidden. It was part of everyday life. Then if you move your attention to the right, you can see the aftermath of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire that happened in 1911. It is a devastating event. 146 workers lost their lives. Many of them were young women, many of them immigrants. And what made this tragedy even more painful was that it was totally preventable. The doors had been locked, the safety conditions were very poor, and the people were trapped. So this is where the idea of progress starts to feel more complicated, because the same system that is producing innovation and growth and these new opportunities, well, it's also producing exploitation, inequality, and loss. So when we talk about urban poverty, about labor struggles, and about unsafe working conditions, we are not talking about side effects. We are talking about realities that are built into the system itself. And this is the moment when people begin to push back. You have reform movements that start to emerge. Labor laws begin to develop, and there is a growing awareness that if this is what quote unquote progress looks like, well, something needs to change. So what I want you to hold on to is this idea as we move forward, is that progress is not a single story. It is not just innovation and excitement. It's also conflict. It's also inequality. It also comes with human cost. And the artists, the writers, and the thinkers we are going to look at next, they are responding to this. Not just the beauty of modern life, but the tension, the discomfort, and the reality that lives underneath it. So now let's stay with that idea of cost, because we're going to bring it into a very specific place, the city. Because during the Gilded Age, cities like New York are growing at an incredible rate. People are pouring in from rural areas, from other countries, and they are all looking for opportunity. They're looking for work and for a better life. And on the surface, cities always represent that possibility. They are centers of industry and culture and economic growth. But what is important is that not everyone is experiencing that growth in the same way. And you can actually see that contrast right here. Now, if you look at the image on the bottom left, you are seeing wealth. You have a formal dinner setting, well-dressed individuals, space, comfort, everything feels controlled and orderly. That is one version of urban life. And then just across from it, you can see something completely different. Here you have the interior of a tenement. This one is a tight, crowded, multiple people sharing a very small space. There's very little light, very little privacy, very little separation between where people sleep, eat, and live. And this is the reality for many working class families during this time. As populations grow, housing just cannot keep up. So people are packed into these buildings, often with poor sanitation, limited ventilation, and very difficult living conditions. And this is where someone like Jacob Riis becomes incredibly important. Riis was a journalist and social reformer in New York who used photography as a tool to expose these conditions. He would go into these tenements with a camera, something that was still relatively new at the time, and documented how people were actually living. So in his work, How the Other Half Lives, which was published in 1890, he brought these realities to the attention of the middle and upper class through these photographs. And that is a shift, because now people who may have never seen these conditions before cannot ignore them. They are visible, they are documented, they are undeniable. So what we are seeing here is not just poverty, it's a contrast, it's inequality, it's two completely different experiences of the same city existing at the same time. And this brings us back to something we have been building throughout these slides. Modern life is not just one shared experience, it's fragmented. It depends on where you are and what you have and where you fit within the system. And again, this is exactly the kind of reality that artists and thinkers are responding to. Because when the world looks like this, when these contrasts become impossible to ignore, people start asking different questions. They ask about fairness, about progress, and about what kind of world is actually being built. So now let's shift slightly, not just to what life looks like inside cities, but to how cities themselves are being transformed. And one of the most important examples of this is Paris. In the mid-19th century, under Napoleon III, the city undergoes a massive redesign led by Georges Eugène Haussmann. And this is not a small update. This is a complete reimagining of what a modern city should look like. Medieval Paris had been dense, narrow, and really difficult to navigate. There were tight streets, overcrowded neighborhoods. And Haussmann changes all of that. He introduces wide boulevards and open public spaces, parks, improved sanitation systems, and a much more organized layout. And if you look at the images here, even briefly, you can see that difference. There's space, there's movement, there's visibility. The city feels structured in a completely new way. And this redesign becomes a model for modern urban planning. It's about efficiency, circulation, and control. But just like everything else we have been talking about, it comes with a cost. Because to create this version of Paris, entire neighborhoods had to be demolished. Working class communities were displaced. They were pushed out of the city center to make room for this new vision. And so while the city becomes more modern, more beautiful, more navigable, it also became more unequal. And this is where these paintings become really interesting. Artists like Camille Pissarro, who painted scenes like Boulevard Montmartre, are capturing this new Paris. You can see the movement of traffic, the flow of people, the energy of the boulevard. But notice it's not painted with sharp precision. It's atmospheric, it's fleeting. Because again, we are seeing that shift. The city is no longer something static. It is something in motion, something experienced moment by moment. And that ties directly back to what we have been building. Modern life is not just about new technologies or new spaces. It is about a new way of experiencing those spaces. So, Paris becomes this really powerful example of modernity, a city that is redesigned for progress, for movement, for visibility, but it also a city shaped by decisions about who belongs, who benefits, and who gets pushed to the margins. And that tension between innovation and displacement, between beauty and equality, is going to keep showing up as we move forward. So now we arrive at one of the most important developments of this entire period, the invention of photography. And what is interesting is that photography doesn't just emerge as a new technology, it completely changes how people understand reality. So if you look at what's in front of you, you are actually seeing the very beginning of that shift. Down at the bottom, that blurred, almost kind of abstract image, that is one of the earliest known photographs created by Joseph Nikifor Nipsey in the 1820s. And I always like to just kind of pause here because students expect something maybe clearer or something a little bit more recognizable, or maybe even something just a little bit more like, whoa, cool, that's what the first photograph was, but no, it was just this fuzzy image right here. It obviously didn't look like what we are used to. Early photography took hours of exposure just to capture that image. So what you are seeing is not just a picture. This is time recorded. And then just a little layer, we have Louis Daguerre, who develops the daguerreotype in 1839. And this is the moment when photography becomes more practical, more accessible. Suddenly, people can have portraits made. They can capture images of themselves, their families, their world. No more sitting for hours having your image painted by somebody. that, of course, is a huge shift because obviously before this, if you wanted an image of something, a person, a place, it had to be interpreted by an artist. It was filtered through human perception. But now, images can be captured directly through light. In fact, the word photography literally means light writing. And that changes something fundamental because now there's this idea that an image can be objective, that it can show reality as it is. But at the same time, it raises new questions. What does it mean to capture a moment? What gets included? What gets left out? Is a photograph really neutral, or is it still shaped by choices? And this is where everything starts to connect back to what we have been building, because once photography can capture reality, artists no longer feel the same pressure to replicate reality. That's a tongue twister if you say it together. So that is going to open the door to something very new, and that is called impressionism and modern art and abstraction. So photography does not replace art at all. It helps to transform it. It actually helps shift the role of the artist from recording the world to now getting to interpret it. And that shift from seeing the world as something fixed to something that can now be captured, questioned, and reimagined is one of the defining ideas of modernity. So now that we have talked a little bit about photography, let's take it one step further, because photography does not just change how images are made. It changes how people understand reality itself. And you can start to see that shift in what's on this slide. On the right, we have a very formal portrait of Abraham Lincoln. And what is interesting about images like this is that they feel very composed, controlled, and almost timeless. And this is how people wanted to be seen. They wanted to be seen as stable and dignified and intentional. But photography does not stay in the studio. It moves out into the world. And that is where figures like Matthew Brady and Alexander Gardner become incredibly important, because during the Civil War, the first war ever photographed, they began documenting not just portraits, but the realities of war itself. So if you look at the image on the left, you are seeing a Civil War encampment. And at first glance, it might not seem that dramatic at all, but this is part of a larger shift, because for the first time, people are actually seeing war through photographs, not paintings years later, not written descriptions from far away. They are seeing actual images. And that changes everything, because when Gardner photographs the battlefield at Antietam, showing the dead where they fell, it shocks the public. People were not prepared to see death this directly. Up until this point, war had been something described or imagined. Now it was visible, and that visibility changed how people understood it. Now people are being confronted with something that they had never seen before. War is no longer distant or abstract. It is immediate. It is real. And this is where photography becomes incredibly powerful, because it does not just document events, it shapes how people feel about them. Images begin to influence public perception. They can inform, persuade, disturb, and even challenge existing beliefs. But at the same time, we also have to start asking new questions, because even though photography feels objective, it still involves choices. Where the photographer stands, what they include, what they leave out. So photography creates this tension. On one hand, it feels like the truth. It looks like the truth. On the other, it's still a constructed view of reality. And that tension is going to carry forward into everything else that we study. Because once images have this kind of power, artists, journalists, and viewers all start to engage with the world differently. And this is where everything begins to connect. Photography does not just show reality, it shapes it. So after all of that, after photography begins documenting war, inequality, and social realities, we start to see another shift. Because photography does not stay limited to just professionals. It doesn't stay rare. It becomes accessible. And this is where someone like George Eastman comes in. He was an American inventor, entrepreneur, and philanthropist, and in 1888 he introduces the Kodak camera. And what is so revolutionary about this is not just the technology, it is the idea behind it. Eastman simplifies the entire process, because before this, photography required technical knowledge, specialized equipment, long exposure times. It wasn't something that the average person could just pick up and start doing. But now you get this new phrase. You press the button, we do the rest. And that changes everything, because suddenly photography is no longer just for scientists, artists, or professionals. It is for everyone. People start taking pictures of their families, their homes, their everyday lives, moments that before this would have gone completely undocumented. And this is where photography becomes something really personal. It's no longer just about capturing history. It is about capturing experience. And I want to kind of pause here for a second and make this connection that's probably already become obvious to our own lives, because this is definitely the beginning of something that probably feels very familiar to us. This is the idea that everyday moments are worth recording, that your life, your perspective matters enough to document. That did not just start with our smartphones, it started here. And this shift is incredibly important for what comes next, because once everyone has access to capturing images, the way that we understand memory, identity, and reality begins to change again. And just like before, artists are paying attention. They are watching this shift happen, and they begin to ask, if photography can capture the world, then what should art be doing? So now we arrive at something really interesting, because once photography begins to take over the role of capturing reality, artists start asking a different question. If a camera can record the world as it is, then what should painting do? And this is where Impressionism emerges. So if you look at the image on the right, you are seeing a work by Claude Monet. a French painter born in 1840. This is one of my favorites by Monet. My father always had this image hanging in his home. Monet is one of the central figures of Impressionism, and what he becomes known for is his focus on light and perception. He will paint the same subject over and over again, like the one in front of you, the Rouen Cathedral, at different times of the day in different lighting conditions, because for him, the subject was not the building. It wasn't the cathedral. It was how the building appears in a specific moment. And that's the shift. He's not trying to create a perfect, stable image. He's trying to capture something fleeting, something that changes. And then, if you look at the image on the left, you see work by Edgar Degas, another French painter born in 1834. And Degas is also associated with Impressionism, but his approach is a little different. He was really interested in movement and perspective, so he often paints scenes of modern life like dancers, cafes, or in this case, a horse race. But always from these unusual angles, almost like he's painting a snapshot. And of course, that's not a coincidence because Degas was very influenced by photography. Cropping, off-center compositions, moments that feel like they are happening in real time, all of that reflects this new way of seeing. So what both of these artists are doing is responding to the same shift that we have been talking about. The world is faster. It's more dynamic, it's less stable, and instead of trying to control or freeze that, they actually lean into it. They focus on everyday scenes, but they focus on the movement, on the light, on the experience of being in a moment rather than observing it from a distance. So, Impressionism is not just a new style. It is a new way of understanding and seeing reality. And this is directly connected to everything that we have been building. Because once photography captures what something actually looks like, painting becomes about what something feels like. And that shift from representation to perception is one of the defining ideas of modern art. So now we take one more step, because if Impressionism was about capturing perception, modern art starts to question reality itself. And I want you to really sit with what you are seeing here for a second, because this is usually the moment in art history where students go, wait, like what am I even looking at right now? So let's start on the left. This is work by Jean Metzinger, who was a French artist born in 1883. Now, he is part of the Cubist movement, developing alongside artists like Picasso and Braque. And what Cubism does is break objects apart and then reassemble them from multiple viewpoints at once. So instead of seeing a person from one angle, you are seeing them from several angles simultaneously, front, side, maybe even slightly above, all combined into a single image. And that is very intentional because Cubist artists are challenging this idea that there is one fixed, stable way of seeing. Now, shift to the right. Not right. That's right. And what you're seeing here is a work by Umberto Baccioni. He was an Italian artist born in 1882. And he is part of what's called the futurist movement, which was all about speed, technology, and modern life. And you can really feel that energy in this image. It's not calm, it's not still, it's very chaotic, layered, and almost overwhelming. Because what Baccioni is trying to capture is not a single moment. It is movement, emotion, and experience all happening at once. And this is where everything that we have been talking about comes together. So think about it. You have industrialization that has been speeding up life. You have cities that are becoming more complex. You have photography that's capturing reality instantly. So artists respond by saying, hey, maybe reality isn't just simple anymore. Maybe reality is very fragmented. Maybe it's layered. Maybe it depends on perspective. And that is what modern art does. It stops trying to show the world as it looks and starts trying to show the world as it's experienced. And that can feel very uncomfortable at first because it asks you to really kind of let go of the idea that art should be clear or easy, because what you're seeing is very unlike everything that we've been looking at up until this point in this class. But that discomfort, that confusion, that moment of, what am I even looking at here? That's the point. Because modern art is not asking you to just see, it's asking you to think, and you are. And that shift from observing reality to now questioning it is what defines this entire period. So now we take everything that we have been building and we turn inward. Because modern art does not just change how we see the world, it changes how we express what we feel. And this is where we encounter Pablo Picasso. Picasso was born in Spain in 1881, and he becomes one of the most influential artists of the modern period. But what's really important here is not just who he is, it's what he is doing. This painting is called The Old Guitarist, created during what's known as Picasso's blue period in the early 1900s. And even if you didn't know that, you can see it and you can also feel it. Everything is washed in blue. The figure is thin, elongated, almost fragile, and the body feels very distorted, almost uncomfortable to look at. And that is intentional because Picasso is not trying to paint a realistic image of a man. He is trying to communicate something much deeper: loneliness, poverty, isolation. And suddenly, accuracy does not matter as much. Emotion does. So the distortion of the body, the unnatural proportions, the limited color palette, those are not mistakes. They are choices. They are tools that are used to create meaning. And this is where we see one of the most important shifts in modern art. Art is no longer about representing the external world. It's now about expressing an internal experience. What does something feel like? Not just what does it look like. And that idea connects directly back to everything that we have been exploring. A world that is changing rapidly, cities growing, technology advancing, people navigating new identities and new realities. And in response, artists turn inward. They begin to explore emotion, psychology, and personal experience. So when you look at this painting, you're not just looking at a guitarist, you're looking at a feeling. And that shift towards emotion, towards interpretation, towards meaning is what defines modern expression. So now let's step back for a moment, because everything that we have been looking at, industrialization, photography, modern art, it's not happening in isolation. It's all part of this much bigger shift. This is what we call modernity. And modernity is not just about new technology. It is about a complete transformation in how society is structured, how people live, work, and understand themselves. So if you look at the images here, you can start to see that shift in everyday life. At the top, we have a woman working with a typewriter. And that might seem simple, but it represents something very important. New kinds of jobs are emerging. You have office work, clerical work, and importantly, new opportunities for women in the workforce. Then, if you look at the larger image below, you see a department store. And this is where we start to see the rise of consumer culture. People are not just producing goods anymore. They're buying them, they're browsing them, they're experiencing them. And all of this connects back to a few key ideas. First, capitalism and wage labor. So instead of producing goods independently, people are now working for wages within larger systems, factories, businesses, corporations. Your time becomes tied to money in a very direct way. Secondly, you have secularism. As science and industry expand, traditional religious authority begins to also shift. It doesn't disappear, but it no longer holds the same central role in explaining the world that we have been seeing. And third, the rise of the middle class. Remember, we first heard about the middle class when we were introduced to the Medicis in the Italian Renaissance. Now we have this group of people emerging, and obviously they're not part of the old aristocracy. They have this economic stability and purchasing power, and that changes culture. It changes values. It changes what people aspire to. So when we think about modernity, we're not just thinking about machines or cities. We are thinking about a new way of living, a new way of working, a new way of understanding who we are. And this is where everything connects. Because the same world that produces factories and department stores also produces impressionism, also produces photography, and also produces modern art. All of these are responses to the same question. What does it mean to live in a world that is changing this quickly? And that question is not just historical, it is still ours. So now we arrive at something even a little bit more radical, because up until this point, artists have been responding to change, capturing it, interpreting it, even challenging it. But now they can begin to completely break away from tradition. And this is what we call the avant-garde. And that term literally means advance guards. Artists who are pushing forward, experimenting, taking risks, moving ahead of what society is used to actually seeing. And I want you to really look at what is before you, because this is usually the moment where students might say, okay, now this really doesn't look like anything I recognize. Is this art? On the left, we have Hilma of Klint, a Swedish artist that was born in 1862. And what's really fascinating about her is that she was creating abstract work before many of the artists who are usually credited with inventing abstraction. Her work is deeply connected to spirituality, symbolism, and ideas about unseen forces. So instead of painting what she could physically observe, she is trying to represent something beyond the visible world. Then on the right, we have Piet Mondrian, born in the Netherlands in 1872. And his work takes abstraction in a completely different direction. Mondrian reduces everything down to the most basic elements: lines, grids, primary colors, red, yellow, blue. And for him, this is not random. It is about creating balance, harmony, and a kind of universal order. So even though these two works look very different, they are doing something similar. They are both moving away from the idea that art should represent the physical world. And instead, they are asking, what if art could represent ideas, energy, structure, emotion? And this is where we see the full transformation. We have moved from trying to capture reality to questioning reality to now completely reimagining what reality even is. And that is what defines the avant-garde. And it's not just about new styles, it's about new ways of thinking. And by this point in the course, you can probably really feel that shift. Art is no longer something that you are just supposed to look at. It's now something that you are supposed to interpret, something that you question, something that you actually engage with. And that is modern art at its most powerful. So I want to end by coming back to this because everything we have explored this week, industrialization, photography, modern art, it all builds toward a set of bigger questions. And I want you to really look at this image as you think about them. So on one side, you see overcrowding, density, limited resources. And on the other, you see space, structure, access, comfort. Both of these are products of modernity. Both exist at the same time. And that brings us to the first question. What does progress really mean? Because throughout this module, we have seen incredible advancements. Technology, transportation, communication, new forms of art and expression. But we have also seen inequality, displacement, and tension. So, progress is not simple. It is layered. It benefits some people more than others. And that leads directly into the second question. Who benefits from modern life? We have seen this in industrial cities, in department stores, in systems of labor. Some people gain access, opportunity, and stability, while others experience overcrowding, exploitation, or invisibility. And then finally, how do we define reality? Wow, we have been talking about this since the beginning of the course, haven't we? Started with Plato and the allegory of the cave. What is truth? Because this might be the most important shift of all. We started with a world where art tried to represent reality clearly and accurately, and we moved into a world where reality becomes something more complex, something shaped by perspective, by technology, by experience. By the time we actually reach modern art, there is not just one version of reality anymore. There are many. And that's not just true for artists. That's true for us as well. Because you are living in a world shaped by all of these same forces: technology, media, images, systems. So as you move into this week's work, and especially as you think about your own role within modern society, I want you to keep these questions in mind. Not just as something from history, but as something that you are actively navigating right now. Because ultimately, this unit is not just about understanding the past, it is about understanding the world that you are living in right now and your place within it. All right, so let's start with option A, the photo essay. And honestly, this is one of my favorites that you have this week for your option assignments, because this is where you get to step into everything that we have been talking about and you actually get to do it. So think back to what we discussed with photography. When it first emerges, it changes how people see the world. Suddenly, everyday moments become worth capturing, right? Not just these big historical events, but just regular, ordinary life. And that's exactly what you are doing here. Over the course of about a week, you are going to take photographs of your everyday life. Just one per day is perfect. Nothing staged, nothing overly planned, just moments. You are not looking for something dramatic, you are looking for something real. Maybe it's light coming through a window. Maybe it's people interacting in a space. Maybe it's something quiet that most people would walk past without noticing. Because what matters here is not just what you photograph, it's how you see it. And this is where those ideas that we talked about come back in. Light, composition, perspective, the same things artists like Monet and Degas were thinking about, you are now thinking about through a camera lens. Then from those images, you are going to choose about 5 to 7 photos to bring together into your final photo essay. And this is where it becomes more than just pictures. You are going to arrange them in a way that tells a story or captures a theme. You are going to give your photo essay a title, something that reflects what you are trying to say. And then you will write short captions for each image, just a sentence or two, helping your viewer, me, understand why that moment matters. You're also going to include a brief reflection, about 100 to 200 words, where you talk about your choices. Why did you choose these images? What did you notice about the light, framing, or composition? And how did this experience change the way that you think about photography? Because ultimately that is the goal here. This assignment is not just about taking pictures, it's about becoming more aware of how you are seeing the world. So as you work on this, I want you to slow down a little, I want you to pay attention, and I want you to look at your environment differently. Because sometimes the most meaningful moments are the ones that we almost miss. All right, so now let's move on to your option B assignment, which is about women's rights. And before we even get into this assignment itself, I want you to take a moment and really look at this image. What you are seeing here are women protesting, advocating for the right to vote. They're holding signs, They're standing in public spaces. They are making themselves visible in a world that for a long time tried to keep them out of it. And this connects directly to something we touched on earlier in the course, the work of Mary Wollstonecraft. In 1792, she writes A Vindication of the Rights of Women. And what she argues is actually pretty radical for the time, that women are not naturally inferior to men. They simply have not been given the same access to education. So when you look at these women protesting, you are seeing what happens when those ideas begin to move out of philosophy and now into real life. And that's really what this assignment is asking you to explore. So for this option, you are going to choose a contemporary issue related to women's rights, something happening today, and then you are going to connect it back to these earlier ideas, to thinkers like Wollstonecraft, to early arguments about education, autonomy, equality. Your goal here is to analyze both the past and the present, to think about what has changed and what hasn't. So you will be writing just a short response, about 2 to 3 paragraphs, where you describe the issue that you chose, explain how it connects to historical ideas about women's rights, and then reflect on how those ideas are still shaping conversations today. And this is where it becomes really important, because this is not just about summarizing information. It's about making those connections. So think critically about how ideas evolve over time, and recognize that many of the debates that we see today have very deep historical roots. So as you approach this, if you choose option B this week, I want you to think about that relationship between past and present. Because when we study movements like women's rights, we are not just looking at history. We are looking at something ongoing, something that is still being shaped, something that you are very much a part of. All right, so now let's move into option C, the modern self profile. And I want to start here with 2 very different figures, because I want you to see just how wide this idea of modern identity really is. First, we have Mary Shelley. She was born in 1797, her mother being Mary Wollstonecraft, who we just talked about. And Shelley is writing right at the beginning of modernity, when science, technology, and new ways of thinking are starting to reshape the world in very dramatic ways. She is, of course, best known as the author of Frankenstein. And what makes her so fascinating in this context is that she is already wrestling with a question that feels deeply modern. What happens when human beings gain new power, but don't yet know how to live with it responsibly? In Frankenstein, a scientist creates life and then cannot control what he has made. So Shelley is not just telling a gothic horror story, she is asking something much bigger. What kind of world are we creating? What happens when innovation moves faster than our ethics, our wisdom, or our sense of responsibility? Does this sound familiar, anyone? I mean, this is like the whole conversation that we're having about AI right now. Then on the other side, we have Zora Neale Hurston, born in 1891, and Hurston is a writer and anthropologist of the Harlem Renaissance, and her work centers on Black identity, culture, and voice. She is navigating a modern world where she is constantly being told who she should be and choosing instead to define herself on her own terms. So while Shelley is asking, what kind of world are we creating? Hurston is asking, how do I define myself within this world? And that contrast is exactly why these two examples work so well together. They show us that modernity is not just about machines or progress. It is also about identity, belonging, disruption, and the pressure of living in a world that is changing socially, politically, and culturally. And that question, who am I within all of this, is really at the heart of this assignment. But this time, instead of reflecting only on yourself, you are going to step into someone else's experience first. So here is what you are going to be doing for option C. You're going to select one figure from the list that's provided to you. There's a lot of people to choose from. And these are all individuals who in different ways struggled with identity, belonging, and self-definition in the modern world. Then, as you go through the readings and watch the video on modernity, it's very helpful, you are going to start identifying the pressures that they were facing. What expectations were placed on them? How were they navigating a world that may not have felt safe, familiar, or accepting? Because one of the key ideas in modernity is this shift towards the autonomous self. The idea that identity is no longer something fixed and given, but something that you have to actually construct, often in tension with society. So when you move into the writing portion, this is where your analysis comes in. You will begin with a short opening paragraph, just a few sentences, where you summarize your chosen figure's struggle. Who are they? What did they experience? What about their upbringing or life made them feel constrained by traditional views? And why did you choose them? Then you will move into the assignment's 3 whys. If you've done the option C before, then you're familiar with that part of it. And this structure is going to push you to move outward and then inward. So first, you're going to talk about why the case matters to the world. And then this is where I want you to think broadly. How does this person's struggle connect to larger questions about modernity, social change, identity, or authenticity? Then, why does this case matter to your friends and family? Now you're going to bring it a little closer. How does this connect to the present, to the people around you, to the kinds of conversations that we are still having today about identity, belonging, and social expectations? And finally, why does this case matter to you? And this is where everything should come together, because now you are not just analyzing someone else's experience, you are being asked to reflect on your own response to it. All right, so one last thing to keep in mind is that this is a 500-word reflection paper. You are asked to stay primarily within the materials that are provided to you in the assignment, and quotations should be used sparingly, and please refer to MLA style. If you have any questions about how to use MLA style, please do not hesitate to reach out to me. I can absolutely help you with that. All right, so all right, let's wrap this up because I've gone on really long this week, but I just want to come back to the big idea that we've sort of been talking about, and that is that modern life is not just about progress. It is also about change. And as we know, change is not always comfortable. So when we look at the industrial era, we see incredible innovation, railroads, electricity, photography, new cities, new opportunities, new ways of living. But at the same time, we also see uncertainty, disruption, inequality, a sense that the world is moving faster than people can fully process. And that tension, that mix of excitement and instability, that's what defines modernity. And this is where art becomes so important because artists are not just documenting these changes, they are actually responding to them. So when reality starts to feel unstable, the art starts to shift. It becomes more experimental, more expressive, and sometimes, as we have seen, a lot more abstract. Because artists that are trying to capture something that no longer feels fixed. And this is intentional because this is a reflection of a world that no longer feels stable or easy to define. And here's where all of this finally comes back to you, because you are living in your very own version of this, a world that is shaped by a lot of rapid change, technology, shifting identities, new ways of connecting and sometimes disconnecting. So when we ask questions like, what does progress really mean? Who benefits from modern life? How do we define reality? Those are not just historical questions. They are your questions. And that's why your perspective matters. Not just in these assignments, but in how you engage with the world around you. Because humanities is not just about studying the past. It's about understanding how people respond to change and recognizing that you are part of that ongoing story. And that is where this course really lives.